Hello, everybody in Women's Health. How's everyone doing? Does anybody have any questions about the exam this week before we get started? Today, we're going to cover nutrition. We'll probably start obesity. We'll finish obesity on Thursday. Your exam is open right after class up until midnight. If that is a hardship for any of you, and I've already heard from at least one student where that was because of the work schedule, just notify me and I'll work with you on that. 50 multiple choice questions, 40 minutes. And the 40 minutes, the limit there is to ideally keep you from having you learn the information and be able to report it on the exam as opposed to having a lot of time to look things up.
How are you going to ask questions? I don't know if you have like a specific style of asking questions, but that's kind of what I'm wondering.
They're multiple choice. Is that what you're asking? And they tend to be more big picture. And if let's say I were to reference authors of a study as an example of a study that we've talked about, I would not just say, what did Smith et al. 2020 do? I would say Smith et al. 2020 in regards to blah, 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 and then maybe the answer would be found what, and you would be reporting, the key highlights to their findings. Who's had my class before who might want to offer up suggestions? I think that's JAMA was asking that. Anybody who's had abnormal or health psych want to offer any suggestions? And if I need to close my ears for a moment, I could.
I had health psych last semester with you, and I can say that even though there's like a little bit of a time crunch, it's not as overwhelming as you think it will be. So you can just flag it. If you don't know a question immediately, just flag it and then come back to it at the very end. That's what I do, at least. So I get as much as I can down at once. It feels like it should be overwhelming, but it's not.
Thank you, Vivian. My additional advice would be, when I've seen students, when they get rushed and they get into trouble, what they tend to do on the multiple choice questions is, as they're kind of reading the question, they're jumping to the answers, like their eyes are flitting to the answers. Read the question carefully, formulate your answer, then look at the 5 options, if that makes some sense. Because students, when they try to shortcut it, that's when they get into trouble. Any other advice from students who've had my classes before? These test items are very similar. I mean, they're not the same items that I had in health psych or abnormal, obviously, but the style is definitely similar. Yeah. And I would say, Vivian, Peyton, rigorous, but reasonable.
I definitely think that it's reasonable information. It just the tests were always harder than I was expecting, even though we took multiple tests. So definitely study more than you think you need to.
The other piece of advice I would offer is, as you study, quiz yourself or study with a buddy in the class and quiz each other. Because sometimes a lot of the material in psychology feels very intuitive, and you sort of, think you know it until you have to recall it. And then you realize, oh, maybe you don't know it as thoroughly as you thought you did. But when you quiz yourself, you kind of figure that out. You figure out, what's the stuff that I've already got down pat? What's the stuff I need to spend a little bit more time rehearsing? Any other points of advice before we get moving?
Oh, I was also looking at the textbook. Do you actually have pages or chapters that we should read of the textbook?
I will not be quizzing you on the textbook.
Okay.
Yeah. And anything that I have borrowed from the textbook, you've seen it in lecture. So we've been over it. So there won't be any surprises there. Yeah.
Thank you.
I like that textbook, though. I thought those authors, they do a really good job of being integrative, a really good job of staying up to date. So I like it, but if there's material, I've already put it in the lectures. Okay. So let's talk about nutrition. And I want to talk a little bit about how I find it kind of interesting nowadays. And this is something kind of new in my life and new in culture, it seems like, where people are forming identities based on the way that they eat. And I don't know if any of you all identify that way. Sometimes people identify that way for more political reasons or environmental reasons. But I think that's just kind of an interesting sign of our times. When we go back, well, at least 100 years back, we find a very different problem when it comes to nutrition in US culture. So back around the world wars, back in the 1940s, when none of you were alive, I wasn't even an egg back then because my mom wasn't born. The problem at the time, and particularly during the Great Depression, when people had difficulty affording food and particularly buying protein-based foods, there were a lot of deficiencies. So vitamin D, if people weren't consuming vitamin D, they'd get a bone disease called rickets. If they didn't get vitamin C, which would come from fruit and certain vegetables like tomatoes, they would get this disease called scurvy. And I don't know if you all remember the story about how the sailors on the ships, they'd be out on the ships for a long period of time, so they wouldn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and a lot of them got scurvy. Then they realized if they took lemons or limes, which store for a long period of time, that they could consume the lemons and limes on the ships and they would not get scurvy. And that's why they ended up calling them limeys. These sailors were called limeys. And so there was a generational effect back then. And the reason why I talk about this right now is because we're going to talk about some myths that have lingered in nutrition based on what a lot of our ancestors went through back during those world wars and during the Great Depression. Modern day reasons for deficiencies are very different. It's not kind of global deficiencies. Individuals who are living in abusive environments, neglectful environments, individuals with eating disorders who are who are malnourished because they're restricting or they're purging. Alcoholism has a double whammy when it comes to nutrition because a lot of individuals with alcoholism will drink instead of eat. And alcohol interferes with vitamin B absorption. So there's a disease process that happens due to a deficiency. Again, double whammy for people with that type of addiction. Individuals in poverty, individuals with food scarcity. We talk a good bit about this in rural areas because there are these food deserts where individuals are so far away from the big city of Boone where they have difficulty getting fresh, particularly fresh fruits and vegetables and meats. And we've seen this really interesting phenomenon with dollar stores. Dollar stores have popped up everywhere in these rural areas. And unfortunately, Dollar General or dollar stores they sell a lot of processed food, but not a lot of healthy food. And so we get those kind of issues. Know that there's a hunger coalition in Boone that serves our local community and gives individuals free food. East Hall is available for food for students who have food scarcity problems. And then I also want you to know about my colleague, Dr. Amy Galloway and we've published together on some things before, but she teaches a conservation psychology course, and it's all about doing behavior to be efficient, to be green, to kind of fit in with some of the mission that we have at ASU. So sort of know about that. She's also quite an agriculturalist and a chef. And so she kind of incorporates that into her course also. So nowadays, deficiencies are rare is kind of what I'm getting at. And there's some special circumstances for deficiencies. Nowadays, the real problem in the United States is a problem of overabundance. Okay. People are consuming too much fat, too much cholesterol, too much sugar, too many calories, too much alcohol, and poor fiber intake. Okay. So more of a problem of overabundance. And if you look at, I don't expect you to memorize these numbers. I'm just showing this because you know how I've compared ourselves to some of our sister countries, industrialized countries that are a lot like us. If you look at the calories, and technically what we call in lay terms a calorie, in physics is really a kilocalorie. So that's why I've got the kcals in there. In the US, we're consuming about 3,900. If you look at our sister countries, they're not consuming that much on average per day per person. If you look at our fat intake here in the United States, we're consuming more fat than our sister countries. And if you look at our protein intake, we tend to consume more protein. Protein and fat tend to go together in foods, particularly animal products. And the protein thing we're going to talk about a little bit more, that's a remnant from the Great Depression. We're consuming too much protein, but we think we need to be really vigilant about getting enough protein. And again, back during the World Wars and during the Great Depression, people were not getting enough protein. And that really was a problem. And there was a big campaign in the US government. When humans nowadays eat meat, they like to eat the muscle on the meat. But back in the Great Depression, the campaign, the public health announcements were encouraging people to eat organ meats. So like eating liver, as an example, from a pig or a cow, as opposed to just the muscle parts, to try to encourage people to get enough protein. But nowadays we're overdoing it. Okay. Let me shift my little pictures around so I can see my PowerPoint. Okay, so those generational changes are residuals of the Great Depression. So in my generation, this would be my parents and my grandparents. This would be your great grandparents or your great great grandparents, depending on how quickly the generations turned over. And we have this really interesting thing. It happens in psychology and it happens in nutrition. And now we've got conspiracy theories about the vaccine. So I guess it's happening in public health now. But some interesting detachment from science where we get popular nutrition or pop science. And we definitely have a lot of popular or pop weight loss diets. So the field of nutrition kind of struggles. It's kind of like the field of psychology. We're really trying to push out the science, but there's a lot of pop psych out there. And I know I've had clients before where I'm working with them and they come at me with a self-help book that they've read, and then they seem like they kind of get upset that I haven't read the book because that's not how we train, by reading self-help books necessarily. But it's that kind of thing of like, what, you don't know so-and-so kind of thing. It's like, no, I don't know so-and-so. And I really dislike Dr. Phil, but I'm not going to go on a tangent. Okay. Grocery stores have added, and I've got a picture down here just to give us this feel. From a cognitive processing standpoint, we can only process finite amount of information at a time. And the grocery stores have increased 400,000 items since the 1990s. And US grocery stores, every now and then, particularly when I'm in a produce section, I love buying the produce and the fruit and that kind of stuff. But it's like, oh my gosh, what an overabundance that we have in our stores, and how much has to go to waste because of all those choices. But you need to know, and this is why individuals oftentimes, when they struggle to get healthy nutrition, a lot of that is due to lack of education. How do you know what you don't know? And a lot of it has to do with all the decisions that have to be made. So as an example, some of the cognitive psych research suggests we make over 200 food decisions a day. Not only what to shop and get, what to eat, how to cook it, how to prepare it, lots and lots of food decisions. And I can relate to this because I like a variety of food. I especially like ethnic and spicy food. But I find myself, and this has happened even more during the pandemic, where I tend to have the same things over and over for breakfast and the same things over and over for lunch. Like today, tuna fish sandwich on wheat with some soup. That's like a go-to for lunch for me. But the reason for that is like, I'm working, like I'm making other decisions, and it's easier just to go fix the same thing over and over instead of deliberately go and kind of spice it up and, you know, create variety. So some of y'all might be able to relate to a little bit of that, but that's a lot of decisions every day. So we go on autopilot. Okay. A lot of people go on autopilot. And if you think about the grocery stores, well, not only do we have fast food where it's easy to roll through a fast food restaurant on autopilot and get food, but even in the grocery stores, they've got the stuff at eye level according to what men buy are higher up. What women buy tends to be around 5'3", 5'4" in eye contact. And then they've got the stuff that children want down low. So like the sugariest cereals, as an example, the colorful sugar cereals are down low, where if the kids are walking around, they're like, Mommy, Daddy, I want this kind of thing. Okay. And so we're going to talk about ignorance today, of people not knowing. Of course, you can't know what you don't know and you haven't been educated with. But some of this has to do with cognitive psychology. Okay. And a lot of it from a behavioral standpoint has to do with what is readily available to us. Okay, so kids are going to eat what's in the home if they're eating in the home, as an example. If fast food is close to us, we're going to eat more fast food. And then again, if we go and shop at the Dollar General store because that is closest to us, we're going to end up buying processed food and not fresh food. Okay, so there have been some generational changes, and then there's some really interesting kind of cognitive science about how we make these decisions. Any questions here? Okay. In general, we've talked about how people in the US consume too much fat. And if you look at, this is from the, it's called National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's a survey that the US government pushes out every couple of years. So we're able to track people's nutritional habits in representative sampling on a regular basis. And if we're eating too much fat, it kind of begs the question, where's it coming from? For adults, 7% of their dietary fat, which is the highest proportion, is coming from hamburgers, cheeseburgers, and meatloaf. So mainly from beef products. After that, the fat is coming from hot dogs, ham, and lunch meats. So beef products, and then like pig products and things like that. And then for adults, about 6% of dietary fat is coming from drinking milk, particularly if they're drinking whole milk. And we've got this interesting phenomenon in our culture, how wedded we are to our milk. I think we can say that the American Dairy Association has had a lot to do with that, because they do a lot of lobbying for farmers and a lot of advertising to consumers. So this is where the dietary fat comes from for adults, okay? So simply, nutrition is very complicated, but very simply, adults could lower their fat intake by consuming less animal products. Got it? Okay, so simplified. When we look at the pattern for children, is they are also consuming too much dietary fat, and they're getting a lot of the majority of their dietary fat they're getting from milk. And again, American Dairy Association, we got a little bit of myth floating through our culture, is this idea that kids need milk beyond, ideally they're getting breast milk. If they are not getting breast milk, they're getting formula, at least up until an age of about 1. But we've got this idea that kids need milk, and they need it, and they need it, and they need it, and need it all through childhood and all through the teen years. But actually there's a way of getting that nutrition with less dietary fat. We don't need to drink another species milk. And that's kind of a weird thing that we do in US culture. After that, kids are getting their dietary fat from desserts. So things like ice cream and cookies. And then after that, they're getting it from beef and pork. So again, simply put, kids are getting their dietary fat from animal products. Okay, so we're relying a lot on the animal products in our culture. Okay. I want you to know about myplate.gov, and you can even get online if you want to play around with you and your activity level and your body size and all that kind of stuff. But it's choosemyplate.gov, and the way they've got the recommendations arranged, like you put in your personal information and it helps create what would be called an exchange program. An exchange program would be how many servings of fruit should you be consuming every day? How many servings of vegetables? How much protein? How many servings of grains? How much dairy? And it puts it into proportion in what would be considered to be a healthy diet for individuals. And what I want you to know though, like, it used to be the food pyramid. I know that's blurry. I like the food pyramid, and now they've just basically translated the food pyramid to the proportion on your plate. But if you look at the old food pyramid and then you look at the typical way that people eat, it's flipped. Okay. So most people in the US are doing the opposite of the nutritional recommendations. Okay. They've got huge portions of protein on their plate, and then very little in terms of fruits, vegetables, and grain. And they're consuming a lot of dairy with their milk and cheese and things like that. Okay. So I want you to kind of plant that in your mind, that the typical American is kind of eating the opposite of way that would be healthiest for them. Okay. and the factors that we've talked about, environmental factors, money, availability, the decision making, the lack of education. There are a lot of different factors feeding into that. We know that a healthy diet is protective against cardiovascular disease. And remember, number 1 cause of death, heart attacks. Number 3, strokes. Number 2, cancer. So there's a lot that we could be doing to protect our health by eating more healthfully if we're not. Certainly, overconsumption of calories and fat contributes to obesity. It contributes to diabetes. What I do want you to know though about the exchanges, I know when I work with clients who have eating disorders, I've got a favorite dietitian that I send them to in Charlotte. Thank goodness she does remote counseling, but she does an exchange program that lines them up in how many servings of each group they should have a day. But then it's a menu. And so that they get to choose, like, do I want an egg for my serving of protein, or do I want peanut butter, or do I want some sliced turkey, as an example. So they get to, there's choices within the exchanges. But I like them going on an exchange program because it helps them intellectually and behaviorally normalize healthy eating. And then over time, I like to move people from, with permission of the dietitian, of course, move them from following the exchange program to kind of mimicking the exchange program, because by that point in time, they've done it enough. They sort of know what's a healthy breakfast, what's a healthy lunch, what's a healthy snack, that kind of thing. But then I like to get to people to this thing called intuitive eating. And intuitive eating is how babies eat naturally. It is eating when you're hungry, stopping when you're full. There's privilege to this. I want to put this out there compared to the people that are eating at the Dollar General store, grabbing their food there. And the privilege piece is also within intuitive eating. Do I want crunchy or do I want soft? Do I want cold or do I want hot? Do I want something that is higher in fat, or do I want something that's like lower in fat today? That kind of thing. The privileged part is having all of those options and being able to follow one's intuition, follow one's body, follow what somebody wants, because not everybody has that privilege. Okay, so kind of acknowledging that. But I just wanted to give you a little history of kind of how you can use the exchanges and then kind of move on from that. I don't want to go over this. Just know that a lot of lunch meat is a little bit deceiving, as an example, because they're doing how much fat it is, not by calories, but how much fat by weight. And then just knowing that, again, we've talked about people in the US getting a lot of their dietary fat from milk. And this is how much fat's in whole milk, 2% skim milk, that kind of thing. So where they're getting that. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about ketogenic diet, though. And my professional opinion on this is that this is probably not a diet and a way of eating that people want to follow for their entire lifetime, unless they have particular disease. And there are certain cancers and there are certain seizure disorders where this is recommended for a lifetime. But I can tell you that, and I'm going to jump down here first and I'll go back up here. Ketogenic diet, people just kind of abbreviate it keto. In research that has helped people to lose weight for health reasons, it has actually been better across studies. So a meta-analysis is study after study after study. Following keto has been more effective for individuals than following a low-fat diet for permanent weight loss, improvement of health. So they have more weight loss, lowered their blood pressure, better blood fats, that type of thing on keto. But a keto diet is a very low carb, and it tends to be high in fat, ideally not animal product fat, ideally plant-based fat, which is going to be healthier for somebody following keto. And it also tends to be relatively high on protein. But because it's so low carb, it teaches the body, instead of burning carbohydrates for energy, and we're going to talk a little bit about glycemic index and insulin here in a minute, it teaches the body how to build ketones. The liver builds ketones, and it teaches the body how to burn dietary fat as well as bodily fat. Okay. And another thing I want to talk about real quickly is the brain prefers carbohydrates for energy, but the brain can train on a keto diet to burn ketones for energy. Okay. So keto diet, I just want to talk a little bit about, put the research out there and talk a little bit about what it's like. But you're going to see it doesn't fit with the my government plate kind of thing in recommendations. And so it's not necessarily the kind of thing that individuals should be following for a lifetime unless they've got some of these particular diseases. Or if they have, I haven't mentioned people who have kind of chronic low blood sugar. This is a nice way of eating for them because it keeps those ketones in the bloodstream, keeps their brain well fed. Questions? Okay. I do want to talk a little bit about carbohydrates sometimes get a bad reputation, but ideally we are consuming complex carbohydrates. And so that would be things like whole grain rice, whole grain bread, legumes, fruits and vegetables. And we're not consuming a whole lot of simple carbohydrates, which would be things like muffins, bagels, candy, added sugars, that type of thing. If you look at this thing called glycemic index, we're looking at when we consume foods, are we shocking the bloodstream and shocking the pancreas that produces insulin with too much sugar, or are we eating complex carbohydrates that sort of gently put the carbohydrates into the bloodstream because they take a longer time to digest? And if you look at the complex carbohydrates, this is ideally what we're consuming more of. So leafy green veggies, berries, other types of vegetables, fruits, beans, legumes, oatmeal, stuff like that. And then we're trying to be careful about things like fruit. Eating raw fruit is a lot healthier than drinking fruit juice, as an example. And then down here would be things like pretzels, desserts, chips, soda. This stuff is going to create a shock in glucose levels in the bloodstream, and then an outpouring of insulin, which can be harsh on the body. This is going to be more of a steady stream of energy, which is why for some individuals, like after eating candy, are kind of like get that low blood sugar thing, and then are just, like, oh, Jones in for more sugar. And people who consume light or low carbs do that. They like kind of eat all throughout the day because they're up and down and up and down. People who are kind of consuming more of these complex carbohydrates are pretty steady, more likely to make it from meal to meal, that type of thing. Questions about glycemic index? Okay. I do want to talk about the different types of fat, and let's talk a little bit about healthy fat versus unhealthy fat. So fat gives us energy. It's a macronutrient. I do want to talk about cholesterol. All of us, because we are mammals, would make a sufficient amount of cholesterol for our bodies. And cholesterol is very important in our bodies because as a fat, it's around cell membranes. And so it keeps fluid inside the cell from fluid that might be outside the cell, because you all know fat and water don't mix, right? Yeah, basic chemistry. And so it's very important for our cell membranes. It's important for the production of sex hormones. So cholesterol is absolutely necessary for life. It gets a bit of a bad reputation, but every mammal makes their own cholesterol. So if we are consuming animal products that are mammals, we are going to be consuming extra cholesterol from them. Okay, which is some of why individuals have difficulty with their blood cholesterol levels. Now, also keep in mind, cholesterol is complex. Some individuals have genetic driven high cholesterol or low cholesterol levels. As mammals, some make more of their own, some make less of their own. But for individuals who genetically make a lot of their own cholesterol, if they're consuming a lot in their diet, that's the bad combination. Okay. Okay, we'll talk about saturated fat. Is chemically a different type of fat that we see in animal products. But saturated fat can also boost and raise cholesterol levels. And saturated fat is solid at room temperature. And so I remember my parents when I was little, they don't cook this way anymore. They've kind of got educated over time and eat a little differently. But they would cook with lard. So like a can of Crisco, which was white emulsified fat and lard. And most people don't do that today. I do want to talk about the monounsaturated oils are the really healthy oils for us, and they're going to come from plant products. And then the polyunsaturated can come from plant products, but they can also come from fish. Let's talk a little bit about lipoproteins. Lipoproteins combine with cholesterol and move them around the body. So they're little Ubers, little tow trucks. The high density lipoproteins are considered to be the good, so-called good cholesterol. They get the bad cholesterol and they tow it through the liver and they tow it out of the body. And one way I've remembered high density lipoprotein, HDL, we want them to be higher. Low density lipoprotein, on the other hand, is considered to be the so-called bad. Again, bad if you've got way too much of it. If you've got the right amount, it's absolutely necessary for life, like we talked about. The low density lipoprotein is the one that tends to drive cardiovascular disease if you have too much. And so again, LDL lower, we want it to be lower, is the way I've remembered that. Okay. So again, you're getting a theme here, plant-based and fish-based fats, better than mammalian animal product fats. Okay. So both the meat as well as the milk and the cheese. And I am a fan of cheese, so I should not knock the animal products too much. The fish fats are really healthy for us. We're getting the omega-3s, really good kind of stuff in fish. The trans fatty acids, there are not a whole lot of restaurants cooking with these anymore or products using these anymore. When they first came out, they're manufactured fatty acids. And the manufacturers were pushing it, saying this is the healthier kind of fat. Well, we found out over time is it's really not a healthy kind of fat. So much so that a lot of states have prevented restaurants from cooking with it or using it in products and manufacturing. But trans fatty acids are bad. They tend to increase the LDL, low the HDL. Okay, questions about fat. So let's talk about protein. We have to consume protein for life. It is necessary for life. And it's the building blocks of our structure in our body. So protein, we need to consume at least 10 of the 20 amino acids that are essential for our body. And the proteins are going to help us with cell replication and cell health. And most of us need about 40 to 70 grams per day, unless we are an athlete that's training, particularly if we are weight resistant muscle training, trying to build muscle and muscle strength. So most of us are getting too much, but again, many people in the United States, if we were to go survey people off the street, they would say, oh yeah, we need to get more, we need to be careful about getting enough protein. But what that does in the mindset for a lot of individuals is, again, this is kind of ignorance. It pushes them to the animal products, thinking, okay, well, I need meat because that's how I get my protein, or I need my dairy because that's how I get my protein. And that's one of the things sort of driving that overconsumption of the protein, the fat, through the animal products. When we look at how nutrition affects morbidity is illness, mortality is death. Again, coronary heart disease, #1 cause of death for men and women pre-pandemic. And certainly it drives cardiovascular disease, the heart attacks and the stroke. When it comes to cancer, the attributable risk of getting cancer is 35% based on diet. So it really is this kind of thing of we are what we eat. And when we eat it in a certain way, it can predispose our cells to genetic damage and spin out abnormal growth of cancerous cells relative to where we consume a really healthy diet. And one way of thinking of that simply, and we'll talk about the anti-inflammatory and antioxidants here in a minute, all of us in this class, I don't want to scare you, but all of us, whether or not we've had a diagnosable cancer, we've probably all had cancer cells in our body. But the good thing is our immune system knows how to not only attack like a bacteria and attack a virus and try to clear that from our body. Our immune system knows how to find abnormal cancerous cells and get them out of our body before they start proliferating and start growing into what could then become a diagnosable cancer. Okay, so it is that kind of we are what we eat type of thing. Certainly dietary factors are driving diabetes, particularly driving up rates of type 2 diabetes. Diet is certainly a contributing factor along with sedentary lifestyle, lack of exercise for obesity. Diet, particularly overconsumption of sugar. And we get this really gnarly kind of thing that happens here in rural Appalachia, where a lot of individuals in the Dollar General stores know this because they stock up on this, really love their Mountain Dew. When I was in graduate school, as an example, like I didn't like coffee back then. I have become an acquired coffee drinker in the mornings. But Mountain Dew, it was Diet Mountain Dew, was my drink of choice to caffeinate me and power my way through graduate school. And it's hidden, but I have some dental erosion that my dentist keeps an eye on, and was like, did you used to drink a lot of soda or drink a lot of Mountain Dew? And I was like, yes, I did. Once in grad school, I did. Yeah, that was my drug of choice. But it's created some long-term damage. And so for me, it's not nearly as bad as something like this, but it's something I have to keep my eye on because for about 6 years, I drank a lot of Diet Mountain Dew. So this is definitely something that we have issues with here in Appalachia. I'll tell you a quick story. My partner, who has hiked the entire AT in his life, likes to go out every now and then and do these overnights and hike the AT. And he calls me up one Sunday, he's off the trail, and he says, I've seen it all, I can die now. I was like, what did you see? Was it a rattlesnake? Was it a bear? And he's like, no, I'm in the grocery store in Mountain City. I just saw a mama put Mountain Dew in a baby's bottle. And I was like, oh yeah. Oh. That's rough. Yeah. But you get this idea of culturally how important that is to a lot of individuals. Okay, let's talk about osteoporosis, because this is something that we women deal with a lot more than men. Men do get osteoporosis, but because women's bone frames tend to be smaller than men, we are more prone to getting osteoporosis. That's when the bones thin and then they break. Also, we know that smaller framed women relative to larger women are more prone, as well as the fairer our skin is, the more likely we're going to be prone to osteoporosis. So darker skinned women are a little more protected, lighter skinned women are a little more vulnerable. And you hear about women who have vertebral fractures, their vertebrae fractures, and they get that dowager's hump, the little old ladies with the kind of curved necks and curved body. That's because they've had those breaks in their vertebrae in their backs. You hear about people breaking their hips, and I can tell you, once a person breaks a hip, that is usually a dramatic decline towards death, towards like more illness as well as death for a lot of individuals. A lot of people don't come back from those hip fractures. And you hear about the stories of like falling and breaking hip, and sometimes that happens. People fall, break a hip, but a lot of times what's happening is their hip breaks and then they fall. They can't support themselves. So really sad. But I want to talk about a myth that's going on in our culture that is different from what the science says. So many of us have been told, I knew I grew up this way, drink your milk, eat your cheese, get outside in the sun and make some vitamin D. You got to protect your bones, okay? What I have learned over time is, first of all, one of the most valuable things we as women can do is we do need sunlight, a good 10 minutes a day. We've got to be careful not to burn and get melanoma and all that kind of stuff. But we do need sunlight. We ideally, I'm going to preach this in a little bit, are checking our vitamin D levels in our bloodstream. And if our vitamin D levels are low, we are supplementing that with supplement vitamin D, because vitamin D is very important for brain health, very important for cardiovascular health, very important for mood health, mental health, as well as other things that vitamin D does for us, okay? What I've also learned over time is that ideally for us women, all throughout our adult lives, because by age of 30, we start depleting bone. Up to 30, you're adding bone, 30 beyond, you're depleting. At menopause, really depleting bone. is that ideally we women are not only getting cardio exercise, that tends to be the preferred form of exercise for women, but we're getting full body resistance, full body weight training. Because let's say you like to walk briskly for your exercise. That's fantastic for your legs and for some of your vertebrae in your back. It is not going to do a thing for your neck and say your shoulders and your arms, in terms of bone health in those areas of the body. So ideally, we are all doing the full resistance training to keep our bones nice and strong, laying down the bone when you're young, like everybody in this class, preventing breaking down a bone for like people in my generation. Another myth that has lingered with us is that, well, we've talked about like needing the dairy and needing that type of stuff. But when in the China study where they compared how women in China who tend to be fairer skin, petite frames, smaller body sizes, you would think they'd be very vulnerable to osteoporosis relative to the women in the US that tend to have larger bodies. In the China study, they consume mainly a plant-based diet that's rather low in protein, but it's also low in animal products. So they're not getting the dairy, the cheese, the animal products. They're eating a lot of rice. They're eating a lot of vegetables and fruit, a lot of whole grains, a lot of legumes, that kind of thing. And in that low protein, high complex carbohydrate diet, they have much lower levels of osteoporosis. The physiological rationale for why women in the US have so much osteoporosis is the lack of exercise, like we've talked about. But when women consume too much protein, it actually, the protein metabolism pulls calcium out of the bones and it makes the bones more brittle. So high protein consumption, which is usually protein and fat, keep in mind, right? High protein consumption is bad for our bones because it pulls the calcium out instead of laying the calcium in. Questions about that myth? Okay. What are we doing on time? I don't have you reading, I don't think, in this class. I know I do this in the health psych class. I didn't ask you to read the Walsh American Psychologist article for this class, did I? Emma's saying no. Okay, thank you, Emma. Let's talk about this particular article. He calls these things therapeutic lifestyle changes, TLCs. And there's a variety of lifestyle changes. Like one of them that we're going to not talk about right now is ideally people are getting more exercise. So that would be a TLC. And this is another TLC related to diet. So therapeutic lifestyle changes. And in the Walsh article, what he's really emphasizing are things that we can do in lifestyle to boost our mental health and prevent psychological disorders. But everything that he's talking about is also good for a healthy physical body. So very good for mood and brain health, very good for physical body. And one of the things that he has done in terms of food selection, and I love this idea, and I'll tell you how this is related to evolutionary psych and biology. He calls it the rainbow diet. And I love that idea of, very simply, foods that are the most colorful are foods that are the healthiest for us. Okay, so you think about fruits and vegetables with bright pigment. Think about salmon and its kind of bright orange color, or trout that can kind of have almost an orangish, pinkish kind of color to it. Foods that have the most pigment in them are also most dense in nutrients. And evolutionarily, we think this is why we as human beings, why it was adaptive for us to learn how to see in color, when a lot of mammals see in black and white. Because by seeing in color, let's say we're out in the fields kind of thing, picking our berries, by being able to see the colorful berries, that allowed us to be able to pick the foods that were going to be the healthiest in fueling our bodies, keeping us alive, allowing us to reproduce, sending our genes down through the ancestry. Make some sense? But I like it because it's kind of simple. And there's really good stuff in those colors, okay? Things that are really healthy for us in that rainbow diet. Questions here? I like cooking with spices. My partner really likes to cook with spices. For those of you who've ever cooked with turmeric, It's the dark yellow that sticks to the Tupperware. Like, you put it in the Tupperware and then it's like kind of stained forever, even though you've got it clean. That's how kind of powerful the coloring is. Also healthy in the TLCs, ideally we are consuming good amounts of fish. We got to be careful with the fish though, if you are a pregnant woman, because fish can carry levels of mercury. And if pregnant women consume too much of the fish with mercury, that can be toxic to their babies. I like salmon, I like trout, I eat tuna fish on a regular basis. My partner, whenever I'm being cranky, says it's that mercury buildup from the fish you're eating, which I don't think I have mercury poisoning, but anyways. We also know that individuals that consume the really healthy fatty acids, isn't this amazing? They have better cognitive abilities, better memory. They do better academically in school as both children and adults. And it's even been shown if you've got a genetic vulnerability for schizophrenia or genetic vulnerability for depression or bipolar disorder, consuming nice levels of omega-3 fatty acids tends to either prevent the onset of those psychological disorders or helps temper the severity of those psychological disorders. And so it's one of these things where if this were mainstream medicine, every psych hospital, every emergency department, every primary care physician, every particularly psychiatrist would be looking at nutrition levels in people's bloodstream and recommending dietary changes or recommending supplements. If it really is this easy just to change vulnerability for these psychological disorders with food, we should be doing this on a regular basis, but we're not. Like we said in the previous class, I don't want to harp too much on antidepressants. There are more psychiatrists relying on those medications than they are relying on encouraging dietary changes or supplements. But this is one of those places where the science disconnects. Common daily practice is disconnected from what the science says. Okay. So if you know anybody that's vulnerable to any of those things, read up on this and maybe encourage them to consider some dietary changes that could make a big difference. It makes sense. We talked about the neurotransmitter substances. They're built in the gut, right? And then they make their way to the brain and do their thing in the brain and the nervous system. It makes sense we are what we eat. Another meta-analysis, again, so this is a study of studies, looked at the Mediterranean diet versus a typical US diet. And Mediterranean diet would be lots of fruits and vegetables, ideally lots of whole grain rice, lots of olives and olive oils, okay? If you kind of think about Mediterranean food. A lot of plant-based food. When you compare Mediterranean diet to typical US diet, they even found people had less Alzheimer's dementia and even less Parkinson's disease. So, and again, lots of fruits and vegetables, complex carbohydrates, fiber, but then also a lot of that olive and olive oil. So the healthy kinds of fats. Okay. Food supplements, he does recommend, particularly if individuals have, they don't like these particular foods or they've had their blood tested and they're low in this kind of stuff, that they supplement with fish or omega oils. For people that are vegetarian and they don't want to consume, like really vegetarian, don't want to consume fishy stuff, there's flaxseed oil. So there's some plant-based alternatives to that. Especially helpful for depression. It's been shown to be helpful around pregnancy. So prenatal, perinatal, helping prevent postpartum depression as an example. And this is the ideal supplement amount. Has even found in children and kids to reduce ADHD symptoms and reduce aggression. And has even been shown these oils in the diet or in the supplements preventing a psychotic break in people who are vulnerable to schizophrenia. So again, this should be used more in healthcare. Another thing that ideally we're supplementing, particularly if it's low in the bloodstream, and they can easily measure vitamin D in the bloodstream. Vitamin D is a multi-purpose hormone. You know that we need sunshine to be able to make vitamin D through our skin. And again, rule of thumb is kind of like 10 minutes a day of nice sunshine if we can get it. It is neurotropic. It really helps us lay down healthy nerves and nerve components. It is antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And so this is the stuff that is going to pull cancer cells out of the body, pull damaged cells out of the body, and is going to keep inflammation levels nice and normal. Inflammation would be the immune system's response to the body, but when the immune system overreacts and we develop an inflammatory condition, we know that is bad for mood for individuals. And inflammation tends to be really harsh all over the body and promoting cardiovascular disease, promoting cancer. So we want our immune system to be effective, but we don't want our immune system to overreact. And one way of keeping our immune system from overreacting is by consuming these healthy things like vitamin D in our diet. Okay. I tell the story in my health site class, but I'll tell it right now. I usually tend to ride high in energy and pretty nicely in mood, pretty happy and pretty healthy in mood. But a couple of winters ago, I had bronchitis that I let go too far and it dropped into pneumonia. And I was out here on my couch in my sunroom with my pneumonia, waiting for my new medication to get here that was called in from my nurse. And I'm laying on the couch and I've got chills and I can't stop shaking because of the inflammation response that's going on in my immune system. And I'm watching water droplets in the rain drop down my ceiling and I can't stop crying. And as I'm watching the water droplets roll down my ceiling, all I kept thinking over and over again was how sad the world was, how sad the world was. And it was one of those things like, when I kind of came out of it, I was like, woo, man, I went for a ride there, a little depression ride. And it was just sort of a testament to how powerful that inflammation response was. Some people are really vulnerable to that. Apparently I am. Another story, when I supervised a local psychologist in our local ER, we learned over time, he would get these patients coming into the ER and it would be his job to evaluate them and make a diagnosis and determine if they needed hospitalization. And we kept finding people with a psych history. So maybe they had a history of depression, maybe they had a history of schizophrenia, that type of thing. But we were also seeing people with no psychiatric history whatsoever, but elderly with a urinary tract infection. And urinary tract infection is going to create inflammation, obviously, an immune system response. And we learned every time, and he learned, and we kind of played around with this in supervision, looking through people's medical records. Anytime he had somebody come in and they had been thrown, like all of a sudden they're in this mental health crisis that seemed to come out of nowhere, whether they had a history or not, we would flip and look at their blood work and their urine analysis to see if they had a urinary tract infection. Because that is treatable with antibiotics. No need for antidepressants, no need for antipsychotics, particularly for a lifetime when they might have a treatable medical condition that just threw them mentally. So this is how powerful this is. Now, I can also add to this, there are neuroscientists who believe that all psychological disorders are inflammation conditions. So I just want y'all to let that sink in. Okay. And again, we've talked about diet for preventing inflammation, but also exercise on a regular basis is going to help prevent inflammation because exercise keeps all of our fluids, our bloodstream pumping nice and good. It keeps all of our fluids in better balance than if we're just laying around and we're sedentary. Questions here?
What is your opinion about it?
About what?
Like their idea that all psychological disorders are based off inflammation?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And years ago, I did some research and I got involved in research on cytokines. And cytokines are these pro-inflammatory hormones that communicate between mind and body. So they are the things that say, hey, you just contracted COVID, or hey, you've got a bacterial sinus infection, or whatever. They communicate. But I would add to that, Jama, this is actually a really good question, that a lot of poor lifestyle drives that vulnerability for that inflammation. And so it's not just biology at a chemical level, at the level of the brain. It's a lot of things creating that inflammation that can drive those psychological disorders. So as an example, let's say somebody's got a tendency for an anxiety disorder. If they're eating a nice healthy diet, that is going to prevent inflammation that could drive that anxiety. If they are exercising on a regular basis, they're burning up the stress hormones that are going to feel like heightened anxiety for them. So it's total mind body health is the way I kind of think about it. But on a chemical level, at the level of the brain, it makes a lot of sense to me. And after I went through my lovely bout of pneumonia, it really hit home. It was like, oh, Denise changed for a few days, and it was because I had an infection, but mentally I've not felt ever that rough in my life. It was kind of like I was in an anguish kind of thing. I got better. Okay. Other questions on nutrition before I venture over into obesity. I'm going to go ahead and venture over today because I've got a lot to say about this, and this is a lengthier lecture. But let me go ahead and pause while I pull this up. Any more questions about, and certainly I'm going to talk about nutrition a bit here with the obesity aspect. Okay. So the word obesity means overeating, and that's a piece to this, but it's not necessarily the only piece to this, because also contributing here is going to be sedentary lifestyle. Okay. That it's the lack of exercise and the sedentary lifestyle that is linked to more of the issues associated with obesity than the actual overfat on the body. Okay. And there are some individuals who, you all know these people that just have this really high metabolism and they can eat anything that they want. So technically they're overeating, but they're not gaining body fat and they're not becoming obese. Whereas there are other people that have these really conservative metabolic rates and very easily tend to add body fat and gain weight. So the name of the word here oversimplifies it, is what I'm getting at. The most common way that we measure obesity in our culture is body mass index. And we do this in my research all the time. It's just, you can't get away with doing body image research or research on eating disorders without measuring BMI. So we ask people their height and their weight, we convert it into metric. And then there are these charts that tell us if we are underweight, if we are normal weight, slightly overweight, or if we're falling into different levels of obesity range. The problem with body mass index is it is not tapping directly into excess body fat. It is taking height and weight, and keep in mind that you could be rather high in weight because you are, say, like a football player, a dude football player, and you're extremely muscular. Like certain football players, BMI would make them look obese, but they're not obese. They're just big muscular dudes, as an example. And the same thing can happen for women. We could be really high in muscle tissue and register higher, or make it look like we're more unhealthy in our BMI than we are. Really, what we're trying to get at with obesity is higher levels beyond normal body fat. Keep in mind, women have more body fat than men. There's lots of function to that. It takes a lot of energy to carry a fetus to full gestation pregnancy. It takes even more energy to breastfeed a fetus than it breastfeed, usually by that time it's a baby. To breastfeed a baby takes a tremendous amount of energy relative to just carrying a fetus. And I can tell you, I was not successful breastfeeding my first son for a lot of reasons, but I was quite successful at breastfeeding my second son. And I was like the dairy queen for about a year there. But I can tell you, as soon as he would latch on and start feeding, I would get a tremendous thirst. And that makes sense. He's taking bodily fluids, right? Tremendous thirst. And then I'd be like, after we were done, like, okay, time for a snack. So it's like you could feel the thirst, you could feel the hunger, you could sort of feel the energy being used is what I'm getting at. Okay, so body mass index is weight in kilograms per height and meter squared. And based on Center for Disease Control cutoffs, they call 25 and above overweight, 30 obese, and then they would call a BMI of 40 or higher extreme or morbid obesity, meaning sickly obesity. We're going to get into some of the stigma stuff here in a bit, and I can tell you the scientists like this term here. There are a lot of people, part of these different movements that we'll talk about, hate using this term. Okay, so there's some politics in this term here. But I want to also add that it's where we store fat in the body that is more cleanly linked to health issues. So most women genetically have this thing going on. Okay, we tend to store our body fat down in our hips and in our thighs, in our booty. That is healthier than women who store their body fat in their abdomen. So this is called gynoid, and you all can remember this, like women go to a gynecologist, they have that gynoid fat shape. This is called android, and so this would be associated with a male body shape, okay? Because this is where men do store their fat on their abdomen. If it's internal in their abdomen, that's even more dangerous than it's external. Most women can store it both viscerally inside the abdomen and externally. And again, we can't tell, this is genetic, right? We can't tell, like, okay, if I'm going to gain 5 pounds, I want it to go here, or I want, if I gain 20 pounds, I want it to go here. We can't do that. It's genetically programmed, and some of that genetic has direct links to poor physical health. There's even some fascinating research to show this body shape is associated with more mental illness than this body shape. So it's not just physical health, it's mental health also. So the worst case scenario is when we've got a high BMI and our waist to hip ratio is over 1. So you can look right here, her waist is smaller than her hips. So her waist to hip ratio is going to be less than 1. Got it? This also, I can tell you, we'll get to this later in the semester in the first chapter of my book. This is associated with fertility. Okay. This, on the other hand, her waist is larger than her hips. Her waist to hip ratio is going to be above 1. Okay. And that can be associated with previous fertility, in that maybe she's shaped this way because she's had babies. It can also be associated with some medical conditions like polycystic ovarian syndrome, where individuals gain a lot of extra fat around their abdomen. So I'm not trying to be discriminatory here. I'm talking about the science, but does anybody have any questions here? So BMI is used a lot. Ideally, a physician, when they're looking at a person's health risk, they're also looking at this waist to hip ratio. But there's a new metric that a lot of scientists are using, and this makes some sense to me. If we want to take body size and we want to predict health, or body size and predict illness or vulnerability for illness, the waist to height ratio seems to be a cleaner metric at predicting poor health. Does that make some sense? So you're kind of looking at this relative to this. So not just BMI and not just this waist to hip ratio, but you're looking at waist to height. Okay. We haven't used that in any of my research yet, but it might be something we want to play around with in the future. Any questions here? I'm watching our time. Okay. Okay. So again, back to the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study. This is some data that we've had over time. And this is a little bit outdated at this point in time, but just to give you a flavor for, we've got, we're at an all-time high in percentage of children and teens who are overweight or obese. And I can tell you in the last 30 years, certainly their sedentary lifestyle contributes for a lot of women. And we've had a really interesting generational change in women where your generation and my generation are a lot more physically active than, say, the generations like this would be, say, your grandparents' generation, unless they worked on their feet. If they worked on their feet, they were probably pretty physically active. But women in that older generation tended to be very sedentary. I still remember when I was working in a weight management rotation for my internship, and I had a lot of Southern Belles in my group therapy, where we were trying to encourage them to do lifestyle change, to help them lose weight. That's what they wanted, but then also to help them get healthier. And we were doing a session on exercise. And I had a physical therapist in there talking about healthy exercise, what you can do, what to be careful with. And I still remember one of the Southern Belles in the class, she raised her hand and she said, "Oh, but if I did that, I would perspire." It was just like, younger women like that sweat. They like getting out there and sweating, and we've got showers for that. Keep in mind, that was back in the day. I don't know if you had any relatives who did this. They would go to the hair salon and get their hair did like once a week. So you didn't sweat because it'd mess up your hair, even, that kind of stuff. So some funny generational effects. So in the last 30 years, women are eating more calories a day. And again, generationally, we've got some of the sedentary lifestyle impacting this. Let's go and look here. Just to give you an idea of how rapidly this has occurred. These are the darker colors, the hotter colors are higher rates of obesity. This is back in the 1990s. This is what was happening by 1999. This is what was happening by 2008. And I want you all to help me think here. I know what's going on, but I want you to hypothesize. You see a pattern here where we have more obesity in the South. Help me know what's going on there. Give me some hypotheses. Why more obesity in the South relative to other areas of the country?
Maybe there would be more like fried food. I don't know. I'm from the North, so when I moved down here, I noticed it was more like family oriented. So maybe a lot more of like gatherings like for eating and stuff like that, if that makes any sense. So
yeah,
too.
You're on target, Katie. So there's a couple things going on in the South. And you're right. Food is very social in the South. Lots of big family gatherings, lots of church gatherings with potlucks, that kind of thing. And then there's this there's this very Southern thing, like when somebody gets sick, or my mom just had a surgical procedure done and all of her neighbors have brought her food. It's like, that's what you do. But there's also, who wants to take a guess at what is specific about Southern food? Who can help me out there? And what are the origins of Southern soul food?
I'm pretty sure it was originated for rural poor communities. Okay. And so a lot of it is maybe not the best ingredients that you can get your hands on, but I could be wrong with that.
No, you're like halfway there, Jamma, but there's more to it. And let me add the more to it. It's Southern cooking took its influence from African Americans, or Africans who were literally brought here as slaves, did most of the cooking. And a lot of the foods that they had access to, like vegetables, as an example, are kind of low in calories. They're low in energy. And a lot of these slaves learned that if they battered and deep fried foods, it added a tremendous amount of energy to the foods, which allowed for individuals to consume smaller amounts of soul food and have tremendous energy to get through the day as say a housekeeper or a servant, or somebody who's picking cotton out in the fields and is out in the fields all day long, who's expending a tremendous amount of energy. And then that's caught on. Okay, Southerners, whether they were cooked for by slaves, like fried foods. fried chicken, fried okra, French fries, right? And when I think about fried foods and you think about the rainbow diet's all those colors. Fried foods, what color would we want to give them? Brown, beige, yellowish, right? Yeah, there's a real difference between rainbow diet and southern types of soul food. Anybody have any other hypotheses about what's going on here in the South? More sedentary. Some of that could be heat related. Some of it's just cultural, relative to other areas of the country where people are a lot more athletic and less sedentary. Okay. All right. I want to talk about, and I know we've only got 5 minutes here, illness associated with obesity, more hypertension, that's high blood pressure, cholesterol, more type 2 diabetes, more particularly osteoarthritis, more arthritis, more gout, gallbladder disease, sleep apnea, fatty liver. Surgeons prefer operating on leaner individuals. They're less risky than operating on larger individuals with a lot of extra body fat. Cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular accidents, so obesity driving those factors. Women who are obese have more issues with their menstrual cycles. Some of that's driven by polycystic ovarian syndrome. Some of that is independent of that. More likely to have difficulty with fertility and getting pregnant. And then women who are obese during their pregnancy are, unless they're fit and they exercise and they eat well, they are considered to be high-risk pregnancies, high risk for gestational diabetes, high risk for a extra large baby, and high risk for C-sections. So lots of risk factors there. More certain types of cancers develop in individuals with obesity. But I want to add here, this is mediated. This could be lack of exercise. This could be type of diet that tends to contribute to obesity that also contributes to these types of cancers. So colon, kidney, esophageal cancer. Obese women are more at risk for uterine and breast cancers, particularly postmenopausal. Some of that is mediated through hormone levels. Okay. So women who eat healthfully, who are athletic, who have leaner bodies tend to have more normal levels of female hormones. Women who are sedentary, who have more body fat, more obesity, tend to have abnormal levels of female hormones that can drive some of these cancers. And then we get some of these sneaky fat cells are even releasing hormones that can contribute to this thing called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome contributes to more weight gain, as well as metabolic syndrome drives cardiovascular disease. And on this note, I'm going to call it a day, but I want to see if you all have any questions. And I'll get into the J-shaped curve next class. Anybody on obesity or nutrition before we close out today? Okay. I've got office hours after this. I'll post this lecture, and then I'll open up my office hours at 2 o'clock if anybody wants to come and see me between 2 and 5 today. So we'll cover obesity next class, and then you have your exam. Again, get in touch with me if you feel like it's going to not work well in your schedule to try to watch the lecture on Thursday and then take the exam after that. It opens up right after class on Thursday. And then I've got it timed until midnight on Thursday. But again, that's a problem. Y'all just reach out and I'll work with you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Thank you.
Y'all take care.